Well, the problem with saliva is manyfold, and I'll describe that. The attractiveness of saliva is clear and obvious, which is it's easy to do. You just spit on the paper, or you let the paper in your mouth and you wet it. But people reference parotid, pure, isolated, impossible to get from spit, saliva. But saliva is a combination of actual saliva that comes from the three salivary glands, plus the serosanguinous fluid, because almost everyone has gingivitis, almost everyone has pockets, almost everyone has a mix of their lymphatic fluid, a little bit of their plasma serum, and a bunch of mixed fluid saliva, not to be confused with the material the person thinks they're measuring, because they think they're measuring parotid saliva collected with a Kirby cup. This is a plastic disc that you place by suction over the parotid gland, and you collect into a tiny tube the parotid saliva that flows, and in about an hour you have collected about a half a milliliter of pure parotid saliva. And if you want to check the pH of that, go right ahead. But having worn Kirby cups for Frank Oppenheimer when he was in Karl Franzblau's lab when I was a student, I can tell you very few people will ever put one of those on a second time. Frank used to cajole us with his Swiss-French sense of humor and a bottle of wine, which we had afterwards, not before, to use these things. And so people cavalierly make major mistakes about pre-analytic, analytic, and post-analytic variables. In other words, they use the wrong specimen, interpret it in the wrong way, leading them to more and more confusion. So ease and convenience, the fact that someone said saliva is a measure of systemic pH, which, by the way, it's not. It's a measure of salivary pH, which may or may not correlate with systemic pH depending on how active the person is and what environment they're in. And in contrast, what we teach is simple. After 6 hours of rest, the urine in the bladder equilibrates with the cells, and that urine is the only urine that you can use to measure systemic net acid excess. The pH of the urine correlates with the cellular mineral status, or the cellular acid excess, the NAE, net acid excess, due to deficiencies of potassium and magnesium, the two buffering minerals that allow cells to work properly. And in the absence of those minerals, the battery shuts down, the cell doesn't produce protective elements, the body becomes at risk, the cell becomes at risk, and down to the quantum level, there's increased risk. So, saliva is attractive. Saliva is often talked about. In my experience, saliva is always talked about by people who don't know what they're talking about. And what they reference is something pure that doesn't exist in clinical practice. And what they have, that they call saliva, I'm saying is a mix of serosanguinous fluid, lymphatic fluid, and saliva, often influenced by medications they're taking, often influenced by the food they've eaten in the last 2 to 4 hours, often influenced by the bacteria that are present in their mouth, often influenced by a lot of pre-analytic and even some post-analytic variables that makes measuring salivary pH unreliable, unhelpful, unpredictive, and have you ever heard me suggest measuring it? No, you won't. No, you haven't. I'm sure you haven't. So please understand that gently you must explain to people that we use meaningful specimens, and that's first morning urine or first urine after 6 hours of rest. That saliva ain't what you think it is. And when you use a specimen that's a mix of things you can't predict, I can tell you for sure you will get confused. And the people who measure salivary pH say it's all over the map, and then they end up not measuring anything, which is going from one mistake to another. So, bottom line, salivary samples are hard to get. Pure salivary pH is meaningful. Clinically, the stuff that people spit is not saliva, not meaningful, influenced by a lot of different variables, and for the same reason that during the day we don't measure pH, we don't randomly measure salivary pH, and even after 6 hours of rest, you still have all the problems I said about the mouth. Therefore, we measure the urine after rest, and that's the specimen to tell us the systemic, cellular, metabolic, acid-alkaline balance, to tell us the net acid excess if the pH is below 6.5, to tell us there's enough potassium and magnesium if the pH is 6.5 to 7.5, and if it's consistently over 7.5, you're tearing yourself down with catabolic illness and cannibalizing amino acids for other but metabolic reasons.